across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, 200 million women and girls who have suffered female genital mutilation. And according to a 2015 report, 20 million of those people are in Nigeria. That's about 1 out of every 10 persons or women who have suffered FGM or female genital cuts are in Nigeria. And to that effect, the Jonathan administration passed a law in 2015 banning female genital mutilation. We want to find out how effective that law has been and if the prevalence of female genital mutilation in Nigeria has actually dropped. And we are glad to have Mr. Sola Fagorusi, the programs and media person for Onelife Human Development Initiative. So, have there been any punishments or any prosecutions under that law? And you're going to tell us the name of the law, right?
Yes. Okay, so it's called the VAPP Act. That's the Violence Against Persons Prohibition Act. It was passed in 2015 by the Goodluck Jonathan administration just before he left office. Of course, it was a loud step on the continent, given Nigeria's role as big brother, like we always like to say, hoping that several other countries were going to follow in that stead. But like every other thing we know, in Nigeria, the same question we have also asked is, what is the name of the first person who has been prosecuted for either performing female genital mutilation or for, supporting the practice of female genital mutilation on a woman or a girl? The Violence Against Persons Prohibition Act 2015 is yet to actually have anyone who has been prosecuted with respect to the context of female genital mutilation. How do you even prosecute in the first place if law enforcement agents, I remember calling, reaching out to the PRO for your state, for Osun State, and even the deputy PRO, at the first headquarters, they didn't pick, send a text message to find out very clearly from them that, look, what is the state in terms of, prosecution when it comes to female genital mutilation? And the very clear feedback I got was that, number one, they also did not even know about the law, which was, very also confusing in the first place, that what is the connection between when laws are passed in Nigeria and how does it get to the decks of those who actually will implement the law? Because again, when you talk about, the estates of the realm in Nigeria, you talk about the executive, which eventually signed the law. You talk about, the legislature, which would eventually, put the law in place. And you talk about the judiciary, which is supposed to also have a responsibility in terms of enforcement of the law. So that disconnect is what we have seen. We also run a federal system. Interestingly, it's easy when it comes to allocation of resources for states to very quickly run to, the center and say, look, hand over to us what it is that is our responsibility. But when laws are passed that are supposed to benefit the entirety of the population, states begin to say very clearly that, look, we need to pass our own version of the law. We need to review this. Of course, the Child Rights Act is still very clear, in mind. The Child Rights Act, in several instances, which has been passed in 2003, still have several northern states. Enugu State just passed there about a year, or less than, ago. We still have several states that are yet to even pass the Child Rights Law. And when you talk about female genital mutilation, you are talking about, protecting girls and women. In very clear terms, what I'm saying with respect to the law is that we also have states, I think we have about 13 states in Nigeria today, that have passed different variants of the Violence Against Persons Prohibition Act. Ekiti State is one of those states that has a law clearly set out just for female genital mutilation. But again, like I said, what we have seen is that there has been no prosecution. Because again, how do you get people to come? The police will tell you, the law enforcement agents will tell you that people need to report in the first place for us to come and intervene. That the only time it will lead to prosecution, the only time they will say they will actually want to intervene is if a girl is caught or a woman is caught, and in the process it leads to death, and then they can actually prosecute for manslaughter. So that is the situation as we speak right now.
And that's a right to life cardinal based on the whole FGM struggle. But before you, and that's like the extreme, right?
Yes, that's the extreme.
Before you even go on, when I was researching for this interview, there's an organization called Preston Development Foundation. They had a rally in 2017, and they were asking for a law. That shows that the law has not even, the orientation about the law has not even been put in place. And that leads me to my next question. Is there an organ or a body that's responsible for prosecution as set out by that law?
Okay, so there were no very clear demarcation because, again, this is a question we've asked. I don't know what the organization you mentioned was, trying to do in 2017 because the law already existed as far back as 2015. Depending on their location, possibly my guess is that Abuja. Okay, yes. Then I'm not sure I have a right, response to that because, it was passed there. Maybe they were actually pushing to campaign to say, look, we need to get these laws actually implemented or possibly have versions of this law at the state level. But then I don't have the full, details for that. But the real back to the real conversation is the fact that if you have laws, it's expected that when it comes to who should be responsible for prosecution, civil responsibilities really is the responsibility of the police force. Okay, the Nigerian police is responsible for that, and so these are several.
So I'll just hold you on that.
Yeah.
When Nigerians pass laws, or when our National Assembly pass laws, they usually bring up and create commissions or bodies or agencies or make designations for such.
Okay, so with respect to this, what has happened again is that we also have the technical committees. Okay, so you have, the National Technical Committee on Female Genital Mutilation. You also have the State Technical Committee, and this is usually, the activities of these committees are seen, are overseen by the Federal Ministry of Health, since really it's a health-related issue. So you have different organs, different institutions who actually work around female genital mutilation, trying to say, look, how do we harmonize all that is happening? And then we're not beginning to duplicate responsibilities, but instead we're looking at actually harmonizing what is happening across the different, strands.
And has this committee swung into action?
Yes, that documents, there's a national policy. Interestingly, there's also a national policy, when it comes to female genital mutilation. And so this also has, different milestones, what should be done. In all fairness, I think the Federal Ministry of Health is actually doing a lot. They are creating the enabling environment. They are partnering with different, institutions. I recall we've had to invite them, to a couple of functions. And then the response you actually get is pretty positive because you're able to see from that perspective that, look, this is what the ministry is actually trying to do in this regard.
So when do we expect that the committee would start leading prosecution? All
right, so I'm not holding brief, for the ministry.
Yes,
but then
interface with the ministry.
Yes, but then I'm sure that one of the things we're hoping to see, which is why you also need to understand, the concept, the entire premise for female genital mutilation. It's going to be difficult. You need to make a report in the first place. Remember that parents who actually do this to their wards, they don't do it because they despise the child. They don't do it because they despise the woman. They do it from a position of love, okay? Except that this is now, embedded in ignorance. Ignorance of what exactly, the implications are, ignorance of what the law says. Because again, if I'm mentioning that you have law enforcement agents who don't really understand what the provisions of the law are, with respect to FGM, then pray how you expect a woman in Kishi, your state to actually understand that there's even a law in the state. There are two separate laws in your state that basically makes it criminal for you to procure or give, female genital mutilation. So the angle is to say, I cannot go and report my mother. The average Nigerian would not go and report their parents, okay? I would not go and report my sister. So why not begin to think about behavior change? How do we ensure that these things are, embedded, are from the perspective of behavior? You remember this gentleman who was in charge of Adolf Hitler's, propaganda, who said that, look, if you talk about every other thing, okay, I would keep quiet. But once you mention the word culture, I would bring out my revolver. Culture is the identity of our people. And so that's why we're saying again that, look, a couple of harmful traditional practices exist. And so that's the approach we're looking at. How do we make people change behavior, not necessarily change their culture?
Yeah, and that would lead to my next angle of question. But I must say there needs to be lots of interfacing between the ministries, of the committees and the ministries, the states and organizations like yours. And culture shifts is like a major challenge or a major need in the FGM struggle. The people who carry out circumcision are like, they hold high positions of authority in these societies. Have you interfaced with some of these societies to say, let's create new modes of economic activity for these persons so that they should have some resemblance or semblance of respect, but they know that this is not what they should be doing, such as traditional birth attendants and the rest of them?
Okay, so this is my position every time I hear people say that we created, alternatives for this individual. I think it's an affront on the law in the first place for a society like Nigeria that is governed by the law, the dictates of the law, where we have the constitution, you know, and anybody who has any opposition to any bias against the constitution, what you need to do is to actually take, you know, government to court, you know, seek redress and all of that. If government today says that, look, we actually do not want structures by the roadside for safety, they justify it, they get, you know, an act, you know, whatever it is passed and all of that. Yes, as much as government also has a responsibility to the people to make sure that things happen, but not when lives are actually involved, okay? So oftentimes what happens is that you also have individuals who say that, look, we need to actually continue to do this because this is our means of revenue. So what has changed is the programming around ending female genital mutilation stroke cutting in Nigeria, which is to say that, look, if there is no demand, there will be no supply. So how do we ensure that mothers, fathers, sisters, grandmothers are not going to these places where female genital mutilation is done?
Hold influence on them.
Yes, these places hold influence. But again, what you also need to understand is not just about these places. You also have what is called medicalization of female genital mutilation, wherein people go to, you know, health professionals. There have been cases where we've heard of anybody who is garbed in white, you know, anything that looks like, you know, the attire of any medical professional is called a doctor or a nurse in most of these rural locations or even some urban locations. They approach these individuals. Remember that the doctors, the nurses, again, the traditional birth attendants are also products of a particular society. We had a case, you know, in December 2016, where a lecturer at the university here in Nigeria was trying to procure female genital mutilation for his daughter during the Yuletide. Okay, so you cannot say, for instance, that that person is ignorant. And it took a lot of persuasion, it took a lot of cajoling to say, look, gentlemen, can you hold on a bit and go and read about the law? Okay, go and read about, you know, what the implications are for your daughter. Go and read about, and, you know, at the end of the day, we were able to make him shift ground. How do we make sure that people have information in terms of, look, this is harmful to a very large extent? And this is one of the things we tell them that, look, some of them say this is a concept, you know, from the global north. And we say, if you come down here, when it comes to issues like malaria, for instance, we can depend on recommendations from bodies like the WHO. When we had, you know, outbreaks of, you know, Lassa fever, for instance, we had to depend on what the professionals were telling us to do. When we had, you know, the outbreak of Ebola too in Nigeria, we depended on some of these, you know, global bodies who had, you know, several health professionals. We depended on the recommendations from the Federal Ministry of Health and, you know, several other, you know, local and international partners. How come now that we're talking about ending female genital mutilation, saying that there are very empirical evidences to dictate and show us very clearly that it's a harmful traditional practice, then we're having people actually protest against this? Because very clearly it's about socialization. There are communities that for you to move from, you know, being a girl to being a woman, for you to be identified as such, you must have gone through that process. In some communities in the southern part of the country as well, it's also an initiation into motherhood. I'm sure you've heard about the fattening room as well in Nigeria. There are very clear indications. We've gotten, you know, evidences to say that, look, one of the things that also happens in this place is to actually show women, teach women how to become good wives, and also make them actually, you know, ready for the man. And one of the ways they make women ready for the man in some of these locations is to actually mutilate them.
To deprive them of the...
And that is a human right. Sexual right is also a human right, you know, issue. So these are conversations we're having around this to say that, look, we may not be able to stop people from saying, I provide this service. If you sell mobile phones today and Nigerians say, look, we are no longer using mobile phones, we want to use another product, we're just going to be using laptops, you would have to close shop and move into another business. That's exactly what we're looking at. And the idea, the goal is to actually end, in line with the Sustainable Development Goals, is to end female genital mutilation in one generation. What's a generation? About 25 to 30 years. So we're not just giving this information, reaching out to people, you know, in the so-called rural communities or urban communities who are, you know, pretty old. We're also looking at young people like yourself, young people like myself, who are the next generation of mothers and fathers. To be sure that if I have a daughter today, for instance, nobody will be talking to me about, you know, female genital mutilation.
Yeah, right. So Osun State has the highest prevalence, right, at 76%. I'm surprised you've not mentioned them in some of the examples. But what are you doing to end demand and interact with states like Osun, states like Oyo, states like the South, where this is still prevalent? Surprisingly, Northwest states like Katsina have just 0.1%.
Okay, so very clearly, in terms of prevalence, which you already mentioned, you know, in terms of statistics, Nigeria has the highest number of girls and women that have been caught, even though we do not have the highest prevalence. But because of our population, okay, when you say 10%, it means something. When you say a prevalence of about 27%, it means a huge, figure. So you have Osun State, topping the chart in terms of the National Demographic and Health Survey Report 2013. We're looking out for, the 2018 report. This is a report done every 5 years. So you have, Osun State topping the table. You have Ebonyi State as second. You have, Ekiti State, okay, you have Imo State as well, and then you have Oyo State as number 5. Now, these are the states with the highest prevalence, which again talks about, what I was mentioning earlier, people's, full embrace of their culture. You would think naturally that in terms of literacy, okay, in terms of literacy in Nigeria, the the southern region, the south-south, the southeast, and the southwest should have the highest in terms of literacy. But again, we can also see how this has moved. These are the regions with the highest prevalence. But again, we're also looking at, if you look at the different types of female genital mutilation, you have type 1, you have type 2, you have type 3, and then you have type 4 that talks about the fact that every other thing done to the woman's, done to the external female genitalia should be classified as type 4. And this is one of the things you actually have going up, in the north. Some people have had to, question some of this data from the north and say, look, some of the things the wanzamis, that's the barbers, the cutters actually do there, could also pass off as a variant of female genital mutilation. And then you also want to look at how some of this information are gotten. Are we sure that we've been able to identify all the different types? But of course, we need to talk about data. What has been happening very clearly in this location is that we need to start conversations around this, and that's what a lot of organizations are doing. We've had people use Play, for instance. We've had people use the last mile tool when it comes to conversation. Data still shows that despite the prevalence and acceptance of social media, every household in Africa, especially in the south, in West Africa, has a radio, while just 8 out of 10 households actually have mobile phones. So which talks about the fact that radio is still a major tool if we have to penetrate. The data from the NDHS surprisingly also show that you have higher prevalence in the urban centers compared to the rural locations. Now, what this also means is that despite the fact that people have left the location where they were forced, immersed into their culture, they still traveled with their culture to different centers. So you have people, go home for Christmas, go home for, New Year's, go home for different festivities. This is also not forgetting to mention to you that we also have people, communities in diaspora who would come together and say, look, we are from this part of the country. Our daughters, we have them in, one is 1 is 7 months, one is, and then they would import a circumciser and bring them, to whatever country collectively. So
what have you done to cauterize demand?
So what have we done? So we're talking to people in the first place. Information needs to be given, okay? People need to know about it. If you don't have conversation about something, if I become a father, I don't think it's wrong. My grandmother comes around, I would not have an opinion about, female genital mutilation. So we want female genital mutilation to be a discussion on the table in the first place. Realizing very clearly that you also have early adopters, people who will hear about it very quickly and say, this makes a lot of sense in terms of the evidences you have given. So we're pushing all of that out. We're also talking about the health implications of this. So in Ebonyi State, that has the second highest prevalence, there's also a center in Ebonyi State, called the National Obstetrics and Fistula Center. And the medical director there has explained to us and mentioned that 85% of the cases there, it's a center where you have treatment for vesico-vaginal fistula. 85% of cases at that center are actually traceable to female genital mutilation. So just because of female genital mutilation, you have women who can no longer control their urination process. We've talked about the fact that when people say that, Omo, Kinkulo, or Nicola, the question they have not asked is, what happens after the child has left the Onicola, when the Onicola has actually gone back to his house? Okay, so these are very hard questions that we're making sure that people are having conversations around. And in some of the communities we have worked, when we tried explaining some of these things, then some of them remember and say, I remember this, my daughter. It was after she was caught that she started having complications. We also have a case where we put up a jingle on radio in your state, and a parent actually called and said, this issue you guys are raising is actually very genuine. What happened? Her daughter was circumcised, her first child. She had a cyst on her external female genitalia, and it took an operation at the University College Hospital for her to actually get relief. And we asked her, so your second daughter, did you think about circumcision? She smiled, of course, no. So we're also having survivors also talk to people. We don't call them victims, we call them survivors. We're having them also talk to people, explain to them some of the implications. A woman called, one of our radio programs and explained that when people say that, look, I had great sex with my husband, she doesn't understand what it means. Okay, so these are very clear indicators. We also talk about the fact that with respect to religion, there is no portion of the Quran, there is no portion of the Bible, for instance, that mentions female genital mutilation. So we also have a campaign going on called FGM Not My Religion. Okay, so we're getting clerics, we're getting pastors, because again, we understand that here in Nigeria, religion is the opium of the people. So we're getting clerics to also talk about this. And very importantly, we are also putting a lot of information on radio and on social media as well. The lecturer I made reference to earlier on, it was just someone who had, who knew the wife. The wife had heard about the information, so she was averse to it. She mentioned it to a friend who put it up on social media. Someone tagged us because they knew we were working around that. And then we had to reach out to another colleague in Ondo State where this, was going to happen. And so that was also part of it. I'm sure you possibly would also have seen December this year, January, a man from Kwara State came online and said he was doing a bonanza, a politician, and said he was going to pay for people to actually go and get their girls circumcised. It was simply because it was on Facebook that this was picked. A couple of online blogs, in the country picked it. Interestingly, those who were also working around this within that axis quickly, set to work, had a meeting with this man, had a confrontation. So, it's slow because, again, we're talking about culture, okay? You can't change people's culture. When we talked about, so we always give examples to them that we've had several harmful traditional practices in the country. When you give birth to a child, before now and then, you needed to remove the, the umbilical cord. You get a lantern, you put, wet piece of cloth on the lantern, and then nobody does that again. When a child is not eating, for instance, in those days, you close the child's nose, you force feed the child. Nobody is doing that again because several kids have actually choked to the point of death because of this. So we're saying that this is for the benefit of the women. And again, we also would show them examples of women who were not mutilated, because you also need to understand the several myths around this. That if you don't cut the clitoris, it will grow as long as the penis of the man and begin to compete with the penis of the man. If you don't cut the clitoris during childbirth, for instance, if the head of the child touches the clitoris, the child will die. Some of them will tell you that if you don't touch the clitoris, the woman will never be able to conceive. And these are myths that we've been able to, sit down, put together information. We've done cartoonings around this. We've done what you call IEC, Information, Education and Communication Material, which we also call BCC material, Behavior Change Communication Material. Even in the local language, we've put jingles we have jingles in the Ijaw language, in Yoruba, in Igbo. We don't even have English, currently, because we also know that there's a lot happening around here. We're also trying to put this in the face of the media. I know February 6th, which was International Day of Zero Tolerance, zero tolerance to female genital mutilation, a lot of conversation really happened around it. So these are some of the several credible efforts. And we are training a lot of radio journalists as well and TV journalists, okay? Just to make sure that in every media house in Nigeria, there's a professional who really understands the issues around female genital mutilation. We're not stopping, we're not resting, because we know again that this is daunting, okay? There are people who are custodians of culture. There are people who think that this is an impunity in terms of, you bringing in foreign materials to what is already supposed to be, cultures that should be preserved. But in the face of, the several health challenges, that really comes with this, it is a practice that needs, to be ended because it has no benefit to the girl child or to the woman.
Thank you very much. It's been a very fluid conversation. And we really hope that this part of our culture gets completely chipped out.
Thank you too.